Thank you, everyone. What a wonderful conference this has been. And over the summer, I had the privilege of leading a 10-week master class in the science of the Noosphere. And this was a really intense experience. 10 weeks, 2 90-minute sessions per week based on 31 hours of video conversation. Amount of work and information comparable to a semester-length graduate seminar. We had a scientific research program built around it, which I reported upon yesterday. And who would take such a thing? And as it turned out, 180 people did take it. And the most important thing I want you to know about it is that we crossed something that I call the commitment watershed. And so there's like a watershed difference. On one side of this watershed, everyone is so busy, they're suffering from the technosocial dilemma. It's just like, oh, make it quick, I can't watch anything longer than 5 minutes. And on the other side, it's just like, I can't get enough. This gives me meaning. That's what the third story is all about. Ben lives on the other side of the commitment watershed. And I think that thanks not only to the master class, but I think also this conference and other human energy of activities, we now have large numbers of people have crossed the commitment watershed. I mean, how many people are in this room have that feeling? I can't get enough. This is so important. Isn't that the case? And so, and what that means is that if you're on that side of the commitment watershed, this is literally a reservoir of human energy. A reservoir of human energy. And then there's a question of how do we channel that reservoir? So what's next? And I think the three things that are on offer, in the first place, inspiration, for sure. So much of this has been about inspiration. Learning, for sure. And then, of course, action. And I think all of us can agree that if this actually does not end up leading to action, then it has not fulfilled itself. So what does action look like? It looks a little something like this. Life consists of many spheres of activity, represented by those little circles. Each sphere has an optimal scale, and good governance requires finding the optimal scale for each sphere of activity and appropriately coordinating among the spheres. This is part of the legacy of Elinor Ostrom that Terry mentioned, and I'm not going to mention her by name anywhere else in this conference, but she is a pillar of what we do. So this is what action looks like. It's multi-level and it's multi-context, ultimately at the scale of the whole Earth. And so how can the science of the Noosphere lead to an action agenda? I think that having experienced this conference, I spent some periods of time thinking, oh, what I'm hearing is immensely practical, kind of like this Amish barn raising. And then I spent other times thinking, oh, whoa, what are they smoking? Head in the clouds or what? And so I think what I want to do in my talk is I really want to try to identify the aspects of the science of the Noosphere which I regard as immensely practical, a practical toolkit that we could use without disparaging the other stuff. Okay, but I do think that's important to distinguish between them so that we actually can get going with an action agenda. And I can do that with 4 words: conscious, multi-level, cultural, and evolution, which I will take in reverse order. Evolution, this word has always had a broad sense of meaning. People were using the word evolution before Darwin, but Darwin gave it a very specific meaning as a process that includes those 3 ingredients of variation, selection, and replication. And Francis alluded to this in his plenary this morning. And so when we use the word evolution, we get the most relevant to action is to use it in this very specific way, Darwinian evolution, not evolution broadly defined. Cultural means that there's more to evolution than genetic evolution. It's so amazing that around the world, and to beginners and novices, to experts and novices alike, when I say the word evolution, most people hear the words genes. But evolution is more than that. Darwin didn't know anything about genes. For him, it was those three ingredients. And so now what's been happening over the last few decades is a return to basics. So people defining evolution as Darwin did, it's called generalized Darwinism, any process that combines those three ingredients, not just genetic evolution. And so all of a sudden, this theory that has proved itself, proved its explanatory scope for the study of genetic evolution, can now be used to explain the changes taking place all around us, cultural evolution, within us, our personal evolution as open-ended evolutionary systems, and in evolutionary algorithms on computers, in other words, artificial intelligence, all employing variation, selection, replication processes, relevant to just about everything that we do. Multi-level means that everything that's pro-social, everything that we do that's extended towards the welfare of others and our groups as a whole is vulnerable to exploitation by more self-serving behaviors. And so, as I put it with the other Wilson in an article, selfishness beats altruism within groups. Altruism in all forms of pro-sociality is vulnerable to exploitation. And yet, that's the bad news. The good news is that altruistic groups beat selfish groups. Groups of cooperators can outcompete groups of individuals that can cohere. And this dynamic, this two-level dynamic in opposing directions, can be stretched into a multi-level, into multiple levels. So it can explain, for example, competition among genes within individuals all the way up a multiple hierarchy of units. And so I like to say that multi-level selection is like a perverse alchemist who turns gold into lead. Self-preservation is a good thing, but it easily becomes self-dealing. Helping kith and kin, a good thing, easily becomes nepotism and cronyism. Shareholder profits, extreme inequality, so on and so forth. But it's humbling to think that almost every social pathology that we can think of is actually a form of virtue at a lower scale. Very little is just individually selfish. Most of it is cooperation, forms of cooperation at a lower scales, which then becomes disruptive at higher scales. And so prosociality and multi-level selection is both the problem and the solution. And it's for that reason that the word conscious is important, because rapid cultural evolution is taking place, whether we want it to or not. And left unmanaged, it becomes the problem rather than the solutions. And so we must make the welfare of the whole system the target of selection. We must basically create an inheritance system at a larger scale than ever before. The target of selection, orient variation around the target. Not only is there random variation, which Francis alluded to in his plenary this morning, there's also guided variation. There's even guided variation in genetic evolution. And in cultural evolution, we do things at random, and often what works is what came out of the blue. So random variation is important, but also there's a whole lot of guided variation where we make informed guesses about what might work, and then that becomes a form of conscious evolution. And so we must basically create cycles, variation, selection, replication cycles, various scales, various contexts, and do it again and again and again if we're going to bring the noosphere around. And I think it's going back to this slide, trying to separate out the more practical aspects of what we've been hearing from the more ethereal, is that on the left here, when we talk about the word conscious, we mean it in a very mundane sense. Planning, intentional, deliberative, not hard to understand. And on the other hand, we have discussions of consciousness, which are consciousness as the hard problem, or is there cosmic consciousness? These are good conversations to have, but I don't want them to obscure the mundane definition of consciousness, which is the one that's most practical. It's just we have to plan this. Not hard to understand that. And so, against this background, if we take the superorganism concept seriously, as Terry did, in his plenary on major evolutionary transition. We can make a very strong statement that functional organization at any given level requires a process of selection at that level and tends to be undermined by selection at lower levels. That's the message of multi-level selection. It does not just emerge or self-organize in a looser sense. And in order to convey this, I actually asked ChatGPT to draw a picture for me around the words islands of functional organization in a stormy sea of interconnectedness is what I asked it to do. And it actually auto-corrected to interconnected mess. And I thought, that's the best autocorrect ever. That's perfect. That's even better. And so the point that this is trying to convey is that entities that qualify as organisms, that are so cooperative and functionally organized, that they qualify as organisms, that's a very special process that brought that about. And when that process doesn't happen, you get other stuff, which is very complex, very interconnected, but it just doesn't have that property of functional organization. We do not call it a organism. And I think I've always been puzzled by this allure of interconnectedness that we hear, everything's so interconnected. That's not helpful. I do not find that does not put its finger on the difference between something which is functionally organized or not. Wicked problems are richly interconnected. And here's another way of saying the same thing. Here's the Repast of the Lion by Henri Rousseau, and all of the organisms in this painting, they're organisms. So they're functionally designed to survive and reproduce in their environments. But most ecosystems are collections of organisms pursuing their separate adaptive strategies, often at the expense of each other. In my academic writing, I distinguish between two meanings of the phrase complex adaptive systems. Meaning one, a complex system that is adaptive as a system. Meaning two, a complex system of agents pursuing their separate adaptive strategies. And the take-home message is that the second meaning, CAS2 systems, do not just robustly self-organize into CAS1 systems. For that, we require a process of selection at the ecosystem level. So an ecosystem is composed of, most ecosystems are composed of organisms, but they are not a super organism. And this quote from Michael Lewis's book on Wall Street, The Big Short, I think demonstrates this very well for cultural ecosystems. The facts of Wall Street life were inherently brutal in his view. There was nothing he couldn't imagine someone on Wall Street doing. He was fully aware that the high-frequency traders were preying on the investors and that the exchanges and brokers were being paid to help them do it. He refused to feel morally outraged or self-righteous about any of it. I would ask the question, on the savannah, are the hyenas and vultures the bad guys, he said? We have a boom of carcasses on the savannah. So what? It's not their fault. The opportunity is there. To Don's way of thinking, you are never going to change human nature, though you might alter the environment in which it expressed itself. And so here's an ecosystem, a cultural ecosystem. It's richly interconnected, but it's an interconnected mess. This is not the kind of cultural ecosystem we want. We want a certain kind of cultural ecosystem. And on that point, we can ask the question, can biological ecosystems become functionally organized? And the answer to that is yes, when they're units of selection. So if you take our microbiomes, for example, every time we survive and reproduce as individuals, our microbiomes are surviving and reproducing along with us. And so there's a very sensible process of selection at the level of the microbiome co-evolving with our genes. So that's grounds for expecting microbiomes to be superorganisms. A lot of interest on forest ecosystems this way. Is it really true that the trees are connected to the mycorrhizae and they're communicating with each other and all of that? The answer to that is, well, yes, maybe. That's within the realm of possibilities. But it doesn't happen all by itself. There's going to have to be a process of ecosystem selection for that to happen. And if not, it's going to be like that Wall Street ecosystem. A lot of ecosystems in nature are like unregulated, laissez-faire human economies. And so we really have to be able to identify the presence and absence of functional organization where it exists in nature or in human cultural ecosystems. And so if we want a spiritual basis for evolution, I think the best fit is with the Four Noble Truths of Buddhism. As with the Four Noble Truths, what we can say from an evolutionary perspective is that life is full of suffering. Why? It's because species are pursuing their cravings, their adaptive strategies, often at the expense of each other. That is true for nature no less than human life. Thankfully, there is a path to end suffering. And while Buddhism might be such a path, there's also an evolutionary path to end sufferings, which is basically to consciously evolve larger and larger systems, ultimately at the scale of the entire Earth. Now, if we expand upon this, then it can't just be only the global good. So here, if I had more time, then I would be able to justify the following list, which I think it flows from this perspective, and so it actually does become a new common sense. So the systemic good must be the explicit target of selection. Conventional understanding of the invisible hand metaphor, lower level interests robustly benefit the common good. Profoundly untrue. Lower level units and identities remain important, but must be coordinated with the higher level common good in mind. Small and appropriately structured groups, a fundamental unit of human organization. This is against the individualism of the last 70 years. The fundamental unit is the individual operating in the context of a highly cooperative and appropriately structured groups. Governance and change must be participatory at all levels, and we must function in two capacities: as designers of whole systems, and then as participants in the systems that we design. And in the latter capacity, then actually we don't have to have the whole system in mind because it's designed so that we don't. And so actually a legitimate conception of the invisible hand comes back in a different form than the conventional form. So here are some examples. Thankfully, although the whole Earth does not function in this capacity yet, in most respects, we do have actually many examples at the meso level, at the middle level. And I love this one because it's based on my conversation with Kevin Kelly in the Science of the Noosphere series. And Kevin is fascinated by the Amish, looks like one too, I might add. And what he says is that you know, they're not technologically backwards. They're technologically as clever as all get out. But for everything they decide to adopt or not to adopt, they ask this question: how is this going to influence our community? That's what causes them to either accept or reject a technological innovation. They are consciously applying community level selection, higher level selection to their communities. And so that's why their communities work so well. They don't use the word evolution, but they're actually conscious cultural evolutionists at the community level. Another example, Wikipedia, and the target of selection: to create and distribute a free encyclopedia of the highest possible quality to every single person on the planet in their own language. And Ann Klin, who just gave a talk just previous to this one, and I have a conversation with her as part of the Science of the Noosphere series. Everybody has to really understand that Wikipedia, although there's a sense in which it's self-organized, the amount of structure that is required for Wikipedia to function is mind-boggling. Just imagine all of the people who want to get their biased content published on Wikipedia, and what must be done to prevent that from happening. I asked you during our interview, I said, you know, it's like Wikipedia needs an immune system, right? And do you actually talk about it that way? And you said, you bet we do. We need an immune system. And here's something else. How is it possible for Wikipedia to run with a 30-to-1 ratio of volunteers to paid staff? Ann Klin works her heart out for Wikipedia and has never paid a cent. How does that work? How does that work? Well, what's the social incentive system that causes that to happen? And it turns out that you'd think that the people who work for Wikipedia are just by themselves typing into their computers, but it's a rich social environment. You told me that many people have gotten married through working on, and you know, when you like what somebody did, you send them a cookie. And if they didn't do something, they're known about it. And so Wikipedia qualifies as a cultural superorganism, which means that it has everything else an organism has. It has an anatomy, a physiology, an immune system, a nervous system. That doesn't come for free. That has to be based on a selection process. Third example, which was also represented at this conference, Bob Chapman was part of the business panel presided over by Michael Pearson, an amazing example of a company at which truly is designed around everybody matters. We're showing what's possible at the intersection of great business strategy and profound care for people. And what's so amazing about this company is that not only does it do an amazing job for itself, but it has now acquired, it doesn't use that word, it uses the word adopt, over 130 other, I have 120 here, but there's 10 more have been added since this slide, other companies, and then also transform their culture in the same way. Isn't that amazing that this is happening at the meso scale? And it's a proof of concept for what could happen at the larger scale. And so I think it's very important to reinforce the point that Terry made in his plenary, that the noosphere comes in all sizes. It comes in sizes large and small. The first noospheres were the hunter-gatherer groups of our ancestors, and the reason that they qualified as noospheres was because those little groups actually were superorganisms. They did qualify as superorganisms in the same way as these more modern example. And so what that means is that no matter what the scale or context, every one of you is a participant in multiple groups. And every one of those groups is cooperative, more or less cooperative to varying degrees, and can become more cooperative, can become more noospheric, and also can become more adaptable, more flexible in adapting our futures. And so I think that is the action agenda as I see it. And so there we go. There's our three things. And I'm very happy to take questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that inspiring talk. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on the role of the encounter conflict between the US and China as representing two particular instantiations of pathological individualism on the one hand and something other.
Yeah, that's a great point. And so that's what we have. And I think what we can say is that there's two things that don't work and only one thing that does work well. One thing that doesn't work is laissez-faire, because it's just not the case that the pursuit of lower level interests benefits the common good. The other thing that doesn't work is centralized planning. And that doesn't work for two reasons. One is there's no group of experts that can figure things out. And secondly, whenever it involves a concentration of power, then basically it ends up benefiting the elites, even when it started out in a well-meaning sense. And so if you might have a group of elites in a socialist nation, or you might have a group of ultra-wealthy elites in a capitalist system, and in both cases, what happens is just things get run for the benefit of the elites. And there's a wonderful book by my colleague Peter Turchin, who's written a number of books, but his most recent book is called End Times, and it's a diagnosis of our age. I think it should be just reading for everyone. It talks about elite overproduction and competition among the elites is what's driving a lot of this polarization. is that there's just too many elites and they're all competing with each other for power. And when there's that much competition, they end up doing more and more extreme and counter-normative things. And so I would think that laissez-faire economies are erring on one side, centralized planning economies are erring on the other side. And I think also, this is something that Teilhard also pointed out, is that there's forms of superorganisms that are not worth wanting. When he said, we don't want to be a termitary. There has to be a sense in which the individual retains agency in the larger organism. And Teilhard talked about that as the pearl beyond price of the role of the individual agent. And I think that superorganisms done right is as a participatory at all scales. Another example, meso example, is a book called Turn the Ship Around by a naval captain, David Marquet, who implemented this in a nuclear submarine. He turned the worst ship in the fleet to the best by going from what he called a leader-follower model to a leader-leader model. And he would tell you that if somebody's just following order, that's a waste of their resources. And if this could work in a nuclear submarine, which is in some cases, really hierarchical and has to make decisions in the spur of an instant, it could work anywhere. So that's an amazing meso example. And if you want to, tell us more about that, or so. Oh, well, that's great. And there's also Team of Teams by General Stanley McChrystal on this. So this has military, it has applications everywhere.
So I'm Malcolm Ocean, guess an independent researcher in conscious evolution. Normally I'd have to give more context on what that might mean, but I guess I don't here. And one thing that I've observed is that there's a way in which the functional organization seems to, like, in terms of, so there's clearly an issue with laissez-faire, but it also seems that there's something where insofar as people would prefer to work for an organization that cares for them like family, or that is a highly functional, conscious, collaborative superorganism, rather than something that's more dysfunctional and is exploiting them to get things done. It seems like insofar as people would prefer one of these over the other, then there is kind of like a bottom-up pressure as well towards the creation of more of these. And it seems like the sort of thing that maybe we'll get at like a tipping point on at some point, whereas more and more people feel able to exit one for the other, that will enable that to be possible. And it seems like that's one way in which maybe we don't need, like, maybe in a sense us being participants in the system is enough, and like merely as participants we will want to do the designing. Like, we don't need to sort of have an additional reason to do the designing, like a moral reason, for instance. Like, there is a self-interested reason to design those systems. Does that track?
That's very great. Thank you for those points. And the way I think of that is a combination of bottom-up hopefully meeting enlightened top-down. So one thing you're saying is that so much can be done in bottom-up without asking anyone's permission. Any one of you in the groups of your lives can get going on this, and that's amazing. So in addition to that, wouldn't it be nice if those individuals which are in a position to make things happen at a larger scale, rather than doing it top down or in a way which benefits them, not others, actually get the message. And at that point, they can actually act as capacitators to facilitate what goes on underneath it. So human energy is like that. Our pro-social world is like that, so on and so forth. So bottom up meets enlightened top down. And then how much bottom up can do on its own. One of my conversations with in the Science of the Noosphere series, and I encourage everyone to view this series. I mean, many people, to have done it in the master class was great because then it became a social experience. And there's quite a few members of that group came here and are present right here, and you could ask them. But even if you watch them solo, you will get a lot, and actually find a way to watch it as a group. It'll get even better. But one of my conversation partners, John Aquila, along with his colleague David Ronsfeldt, made the following point. First there was the age of empires. Then there was the age of nation states. Next up, the age of networks. And so much is happening, bottom up through networks, that is a very, very strong force, and it's ultimately maybe the form that governance will take, even at some point replacing the nation state. So it does speak to the power of bottom up and networks. But top down is good too. And an example of that is Microsoft, of all things, in its third CEO, first Bill Gates, then Steve Ballmer, and now Satya Nadella. And Satya Nadella being a much more empathetic person. Nothing he learned in business school, I promise you that. And so part of this is reforming the business school curriculum, and that's why Michael Pearson is here. But because of the fact that in some sense he did get it, and he's in a position top down to implement that through his organization. And so Microsoft is actually doing things differently than it was before. So anyhow, thank you.
Yeah, my name is Gino Yu from Hong Kong.
Hey.
I do research in phenomenology, neurophysiology, and really looking at development as well too. And in your talk, you give a number of examples of these kind of groups that come together. I'm just curious around the governance that you mentioned, and also kind of the operating system, if you will, in terms of in early days, you would call it a functional mythology. And so 5,000 years ago, your understanding of reality was dictated by where on the planet you lived and what the religious tradition was. And usually it's constructed by the mythology, the art, and the rituals, and it serves four functions: the cosmological function, the pedagogical function, the societal function, and the mystical function. And so right now, it seems like we have no functional mythology, and within these groups, they're kind of, I think things are emerging, and these are a lot of different case studies that you have of different people that have created different cultures, from this. Can you talk a little bit about kind of the possibility of engineering these kind of cultures based upon what we know about the science of consciousness, about human development and everything, and knowing that different people are at different stages to create kind of an operating system, if you will? There have been attempts like holacracy and everything in this area. I'm just curious as to, is there a kind of a science that's emerging in this space for us to create these kind of operating systems for organizations? Thank you.
I want to first answer it at the micro scale and then answer it at the micro scale. The micro scale, we have Eleanor Ostrom and her core design principles, which is kind of the blueprint for this. And the first core design principle is a strong sense of identity and purpose. If you don't have that, you're not going to be an effective group. If you do have that, and then if you have the other protections of the core design principles, which basically make it difficult to misbehave within the group, then what happens is you've created an environment that's so safe and secure for being pro-social that the members of the group actually perceive that, and without needing to be taught, they just come out of their shells and they experience something which they will themselves describe as love. And it all depends. It all begins with a strong sense of identity and purpose. At the macro scale, I think envisioning the whole Earth as our unit. First and foremost, I am a human being and citizen of the Earth. Okay. That was beyond the imagination until about 200 years ago. But I think now, given all the globalization that's happened, and in many ways, for many of us, it's the only thing that makes sense. And then how it gets communicated is we get, for example, the Dalai Lama, Beyond Religion, Ethics for the Whole World. And I think the third story is an attempt to provide that narrative. And then the final thing I'd want to say is that a degree of pluralism is also called for. At the end of the day, we might end up all, in terms of our outer intentions, be working towards a whole Earth ethic, but the way we do it might be different. And this is sometimes called interspirituality, where there's what's called a first-tier consciousness. Some of you might be familiar with this. A first-tier consciousness, which is your particular tradition. But they all lead to this awareness of interconnectedness and so on and so forth. And so there's a second-tier consciousness, and you can operate in both spheres. You can't leave your current tradition. It's part of who you are. But what you can do is you can enter into this second tier in which you then enjoy each other's perspectives, and then you appropriately coordinate. So.